week, we've invited Tilly Maddox to share with us her inspirational story of growing up in Nazi-occupied Holland during World War II. While Tilly hails from Holland, she now makes her home in Marblehead and Roaring Fork Valley, Colorado. Try saying that 3 times fast. Tilly is here tonight with her technical advisor, also known as her husband, Parker. Please join me in welcoming Tilly and Parker to the JCC. I'm not going to share too much more about Tilly because she has a wonderful presentation to share with you about her life. So I'd like to now introduce you to tonight's speaker, Tilly Maddox.
Never used to sing like this. I have to get used to talking right into it. The story that you're going to hear tonight is put together by me and my brothers and sisters, and my husband helped me with putting the slides on. They were just slides, and he put them on PowerPoint, which was a tremendous job. Can you hear in the back? No?
Can you talk a little bit louder?
A little bit louder. Okay. I better have it in my hand. Outside of Holland, very little is known about the events that took place during that
Sorry, Tilly.
during that country. Why does it? Oh, here we go. During the German occupation, and most people are familiar with the diary of Anne Frank, and maybe have heard about the firebombing of Rotterdam, which is our major port in Holland. But even Churchill's memoirs devote a very small passage to the Netherlands. This is a very old map from my school days. Better? The ocean, the inner ocean you see there is now all filled in, and lots of new villages and roads have been built there. But although the Americans took part in the liberation of Holland, it was principally a Canadian operation. And this is the story of my childhood in Holland during World War II. This is the first part of my family. There are quite a few more to come. I am the third one from the right with the big bow on my head. By 1939, the Dutch had been at peace since the time of Napoleon, and Germany and Holland had never been enemies. The Royal House of Holland, of Orange, originated in Nassau, Germany, and even our national anthem starts with the line, Wilhelmus van Nassau en ik van Duitse bloed. I mean, I'm William of Nassau and I'm of German blood. The second line is stranger even. This is a song from the 17th century. De koning van Hispanje bleef ik trouw tot in den dood. The king of Spain I will be faithful to until I die. It's still sang this way. The Dutch as a whole are very sober people, and many consider the Germans arrogant and overbearing. And they made jokes about the pomposity in German literature and music, such as Wagner's music. And they chuckled about Hitler's histrionic speeches. I can still remember his screaming voice on our radio. And talk about a German master race amused the Dutch people. Radicalism and fanaticism were unfamiliar concepts. In addition, the Dutch are very individualistic and almost anarchistic by nature. For example, at the beginning of the war we had at least 32 political parties. But by 1939, the Dutch recognized the coming threat and declared their neutrality, just like they had done during the Great World War I. This is a newspaper from October 1939. And does that look familiar? Russian troops in Afghanistan? Plans for a peace offensive? And Dutch minesweepers damaged? So this is really the beginning of their downfall. And people believed that if Hitler had any design on Holland, all the Prime Minister had to do was to push a button and flood the threatened areas. They had done this during the War of Independence from Spain in the 17th century. And besides that, England, their sea trading partner, would never permit an invasion. In addition, the Dutch army had the most modern equipment. They moved the army always on bicycles. So Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with Holland on May 3, 1940. Here he is with the Prime Minister that day of Holland, Minister de Geer, and the Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain. A week later, on May 10, Germany invaded anyway. And that was Chamberlain was forced to resign. It was a crisp and cloudless day, and people woke up to the roar of airplanes overhead. Louder? Oops. What happened? Oh. They ran into the streets in their pajamas, and we all looked up stunned at this armada overhead. They still thought that the planes were on their way to England as they flew out over the North Sea. But that was a trick, and the German planes turned back and started bombing the airfields. And at the same time, the German troops crossed our borders. My father, who was a surgeon, general surgeon, Boermond, oops, he's the second from the left. The other three surgeons, this was a Catholic hospital, and the other three surgeons were his pupils. As a general surgeon, he used to do everything from setting bones to delivering babies. He delivered all his 11 children on Saturday. That was his day off. We lived in the south of Holland, and my father, he decided that day it was a crisp and nice day to walk to the hospital. But he encountered the very first German troops who were singing at the top of their lungs, "We zullen naar Engeland varen." We're on our way to England. They had just been told as soon as they crossed the channel, which was really our river, that they would be in England. So my father said, "A little bit further." At first, it's peeping.
I'm sorry, I'm going to try and adjust that. Can I suggest if anyone in the back can't hear, you can pull your chairs up closer? Or feel free to sit up closer.
I'll try to talk straight in the microphone. At first, the Dutch tried to defend themselves with pieces of artillery that were made before 1900. But the Germans firebombed Rotterdam, and Holland capitulated. The center of Rotterdam was in ruins. The government escaped to England, and many people resented that. But it turned out that a government in exile was much more effective than in German hands. And all through the war, the Queen Wilhelmina broadcast messages of hope on the BBC, and that kept the spirits up and the underground resistance going. Here she is in London, inspecting the troops. The invasion was completed within 5 days, and the success was partly due to the theft of Dutch uniforms, army uniforms, before the war by sympathizers and infiltrators. And the Dutch certainly were not going to shoot at people who looked just like themselves. They had a shortage of helmets, and they came in with helmets that were made of cardboard and that looked just like the real thing. The Dutch tried to stop the advancing troops by blowing up the bridges. And I have to apologize for some of the pictures are very poor quality, but they're very old. But the Germans crossed the rivers in inflatables instead. Then an Austrian Nazi by the name of Seyss-Inquart, he became the head of Holland. I went too fast on that. There he is. Doesn't he look like a Nazi? And he brought with him his subordinate, the hated Router, a member of the Gestapo. And as soon as the bombs stopped raining on Rotterdam, there began a reign of decrees. For example, no flag of the House of Holland was going to be allowed to be shown anymore. You had to be, there was curfew, you had to have permits for everything, from owning a bicycle, and you needed food stamps and stamps for soap, shoes, textiles, everything that was of any value was shipped to Germany. These are food stamps that were left over from my parents' little booklet. And even the church bells, the metal was then used to make bombs. Then the bicycles were taken. In Amsterdam alone, 8,000 bicycles were taken. And next, the museums were looted. Göring was very fond of the old Dutch masters. In spite of that, the Dutch people still fraternized with the occupying army at the beginning of the war. Especially the girls. Those uniforms, they looked very handsome. This is a ship that goes through sightseeing boat through the canals of Amsterdam. We were told to take the lock out of our front door, and I will never forget that strange soldiers just walked into our house and rifled through our parents' coats and took whatever they wanted. I was hiding upstairs behind the landing with my mother, and she put her hand over my mouth so I wouldn't make a sound. And she told us that those men would shoot any child that was in their way. This is a picture, that's the typical pictures that my sisters and brothers would draw at the time. Still, we like to play jokes on the Germans, and being too young to realize the risk we were taking, the house across from us became headquarters for some German officers. And when there was no more heating oil, they had a coal stove, and a pipe was stuck out through a crack in the window. And it was snowing one day, and guess what we did? We put some snow in that pipe and ran around the corner to see what would happen. And my brothers and sisters ran as fast as they could, and within minutes the Germans came tumbling out of that house, clutching their throats with one hand and their rifles with the other. They were coughing like crazy, and at the same time trying to see who had done such a deed. When we got home and told our story, our parents were so frightened for us, they lined us all up. And that was a long line by then, and we all got spankings. They didn't want to find out who had done what. Everyone was the same as far as they were concerned. The Dutch are famous for their orderliness, and so the Germans found files on every citizen in perfect order, and that became the downfall of the Jewish population in Holland. Out of 140,000 Jews, only 4% survived the war. It was also easy for the Germans to control the 9 million Dutch people. The country has no mountains and very good roads, and only 7% is forested. The resistance movement was very discombobulated in the beginning, but it slowly but surely got better organized. Contact with the Allies was very difficult. since the entire coast and harbors were heavily guarded. Radio was still something new, and until all radios had to be given to the authorities, they were the only contact with the outside world. Everyone along the coast was told to leave. But the Dutch invented an ingenious way to get secret messages from one end of the country to the other. The windmills. They were much more numerous then than they are now, and a miller could set a sail a certain way, and that meant one thing, or another way meant something else. And the mills were all on high bluffs and dikes to catch the wind. So he could send a message of danger or dive under to the next mill on the horizon. And that miller would then send it on until the message had traveled miles across the country. And that became such an efficient way of communication that messages could be sent from one end of the country to the other and within 7 minutes. And that was nothing new. Millers had been doing this for decades. I went too fast. This one. Windmills were often decorated when a child was born, and then the surrounding villagers, they knew by the colors on the sails if it was a boy or a girl. And during a funeral, the miller could turn the entire top with the sails and followed the procession until it reached the cemetery. And the windmill code was never broken by the Nazis. But soon Germany found out that it was not as easy to assimilate the Dutch in the great German Empire. And so Hitler drew up a plan to ship the entire population of 9 million people to the sparsely populated Baltic states. Logistically, that turned out to be difficult at best. And so the Nazis went after the Jewish people instead. Signs went up like this: no Jews allowed. And hoping not to cause any alarm, the German harassment of the Jewish people started out slowly. First they lost their government jobs, and then their teaching jobs, and then they were not allowed to work anywhere anymore, and the roundups began. The next two pictures are taken by my father secretly with his little brownie camera on the way to the hospital. Jew catching started in 1941 during night raids on their homes. The Nazis simply closed off certain streets and went from house to house and pulled people out of their beds. Percentage-wise, Holland lost more Jews than any other country. This picture is taken very close to our house. The worst disaster for Germany, said an officer in Hitler's army after the war, was tying up all those freight trains with Jews and other undesirables. The woman who helped my mother, that's her. Her name is Bert de Vries, and she's sitting in front of our playhouse and it's me looking through the window. She was Jewish. And she got a notice one day to show up at the local movie theater and to bring a fur coat and any jewelry she had. She was early and sat in the front row, but soon the theater filled up with all her friends and family, and it was hot in there. And she felt very uneasy and decided she did not want to stay. She picked up her coat and her jewelry and simply went out through the middle aisle and came back to her house. Nobody stopped her, and she stayed with us until the end of the war. None of the other people in the theater returned. She wrote us a letter after the war, which I will read passages of at the end of my talk. My brothers and sisters were told never to say anything at school about what the family did. and we were told to speak softly in the house. Sometimes the door to my dad's consultation room was locked for weeks. Later we found out that behind that door rescued pilots lived until such time the resistance could get them to Switzerland or Spain. Clothing and food got more and more scarce, and soon my mother, like this woman on the bicycle, went to the farms to try to get some food and to barter her jewelry. And my mother bartered most of her jewelry for food. All food was rationed, however, and it was a disaster to be caught on the way home and to lose all those precious goods to the control officers. But she took often her 3 smallest children with her on the bicycle to inspire sympathy from the farmers. And if you have seen a Dutch bicycle, it has a double seat on the back and one on the front on the steering wheel. You can transport a lot of kids that way. In winter, darkness fell early, sometimes at 3 o'clock, and sometimes my dad allowed us to stand outside in the garden to see the planes come over on their way to bomb Germany. And the German aircraft gunners, they shone their spotlights against the sky. We watched in fascination. We rooted, of course, for the pilots, but we knew when the searchlights crossed that the plane was caught. We would see flames and then a plume of smoke and sometimes a parachute. But most of the time we had to stay inside during the air raids. We kept growing. Our dresses got strips of cloth sewn onto the bottoms to make them last longer. And the shoes were made to fit a little bit longer by cutting out the toes, which my mother did at least 10 more years after the war. And later on we wore those wooden sandals with strips of cloth to keep them on. And when it was really cold in winter, we put paper in it or straw. Rubber was soon also unavailable, and bicycle wheels were then fitted with pieces of wood shaped to fit the rim. It was very tiring pedaling and hard for us kids to sit on the back. We were always had blue spots on our bottoms. The first new clothes I got was from the Marshall help after the war was over. Americans sent goods to Europe, and maybe some of you did, and sometimes put a name or an address in. And so I got a doll from an American girl from Minnesota. Her name was Sue Jelensi, and she became my pen pal for many, many years. Until one day when I was in college, her mother called me and said, I won't be able to write to Sue anymore because she has become a member of a silent order, the Carmelites, which was very sad for me. Slowly but surely, the resistance movement became better organized, and with promises of food and pay and cheerful posters put up by the Germans found it still hard to get the Dutchmen to work for them. It says, are you content? He works in Germany. Many younger men went into hiding when the Germans ordered all men between the ages of 17 and 40 to register for work in Germany. A few went voluntarily, but sent back reports about the terrible conditions. They had to wear filthy uniforms and boots that had been chewed by rats, and some of the uniforms still had blood stains on from the previous owner. And after that news leaked out, many decided to go in hiding. And the farms, they were referred to us as divers. It says, don't go, don't let yourself be caught, dive under. The farms were good hiding places, but the divers also hid in basements and crawl spaces. And under our playroom was such a crawl space, and a grown person could barely sit up in it, and there was always someone there. after the war, we found several parachutes in there that we used as show and tell at schools. My father had a very big wine cellar, and the wine racks obscured the opening to the crawl space. And the wine bins were empty because he had buried all that wine 6 feet deep in the yard. And so instead the racks held potatoes and other foodstuffs. We were never allowed to go in there, and the cellar was, at that part, was always locked. As I said before, radio was still a new invention, and many people found it sort of glamorous to work for the radio system, but soon were forced to send out anti-Semitic programs and programs glorifying Hitler. One such program was called "For Women, Mother, Tell Me About Adolf Hitler." Fortunately, the BBC had counter-propaganda. By 1943, the Germans had confiscated all radios. And that was easy because in Holland you had to pay a listening tax. And so they knew who had what. And some got away with it by delivering old broken sets and hiding the good ones. And my father did that too. He hollowed out a book and he put his little radio in there and listened to the BBC. Well, he was hiding in a deep closet, and one of his kids would always stand guard. Because, as I said before, we didn't have a lock on the door. We were not allowed to lock the doors. Transportation became more and more primitive as resources diminished. Horses were actually eaten at one point. And so people had to become their own horse. Notice the wooden shoes on the person that is being the horse. The Germans required different groups to sign loyalty oath, and the university students were the first to be asked, but most of them refused. And then the doctors were asked to sign, and almost all of them refused and got away with that because the Germans really needed their doctors badly. Diseases like TB reached epidemic proportions. I spent a whole year in the sanatorium with one of my brothers. The doctors protested the loyalty oath by going on strike and into hiding, and my father disappeared by jumping over the balcony to the next house and then the next house, and he simply disappeared to the great anxiety of my mother. But finally the Germans gave up, and when that order was rescinded, all the doctors came back and went to work again. My father had brought his car to a farm where it was hidden under the hay for the duration of the war. His motorcycle, however, was stolen, and so it was very difficult to visit patients in the countryside. So he had to do that on bicycle, and often had to bicycle long distances to deliver a baby or do other emergency work. The hospital was about a half hour from our house, and when the Allies started bombing raids, he often had to dart from doorway to doorway with shrapnel ricocheted around him. By 1944, the town was mostly evacuated since we were so close to the German border. So people were put in open trucks for the long trip north where it was safer. And this happened during a very, very cold winter. Many didn't make it, freezing to death in the open trucks. All doctors and nurses had to stay, and so we moved from our basement to the hospital basement. We got a big space for ourselves. We slept on carpets that were piled up, a huge pile, and we all slept next to each other. And the older children were very happy not to have to go to school that year. And as you saw, the hospital was run by a Catholic order, and the nuns and priests liked to have the regular glass of wine. And as a result, the hospital had very vast wine cellars in the basement. They also had the foresight to bury that wine. in the yard. So the empty bins, wine bins, were used as cradles for newborn babies. My younger siblings, born in the war, being put in those bins, became wine lovers by osmosis. And the nurses slept on the fruit drying racks. As you can see, it's a typical wartime picture, very grainy. That's me at age 6 or so. Because of lack of ventilation in that basement, the moist air condensed, and so umbrellas had to be placed over our beds. It was always raining on top of us. The cellars were connected only to sewers in one place, and there were no toilets. So wooden wine barrels with a plank across it had to do the job. And if you don't think it's scary for a 4 or 5-year-old to sit on a high wooden barrel on top of, in the dark, you don't know what scare is. When the electricity went out, our surgery had to be done by candlelight or petroleum lamps. All the patients also had to be moved to the cellar in a little separate spot from us, fortunately. Water was gotten from a pump, and people who were in hiding in the hospital manned the pumps day and night. And a huge red cross was painted on the roof to prevent bombing. We had numerous playmates because lots of the nurses had kids, and we would run enthusiastically through the hospital halls with gurneys. It was a great sport to glide on the highly polished floors on cardboard mats under the hospital beds. Most of the patients were then also in the basement. And my father would operate there sometimes 36 hours in a row without food or water and no sleep. With the evacuation of the town, however, the farmers had to leave their cattle behind, and there were regular deliveries of animals were slaughtered in the back, and that was our television entertainment. And when we heard explosions, we would go to the front door and see what victims were being brought in. We were scared, but we still wanted to look. Secretly, we visited the Dodegang, the Hall of the Dead. It was just a little, it was also in the cellars, not very far from where we had to sleep. Burials only could take place when there was no air raid, so even the dead had to suffer because there was no wood. Cardboard boxes had to be used as coffins. And the Germans blamed the Allies for all that suffering. It says Anglo-American warmongering. Wounded Allied pilots and divers often ended up in hospital. My father would put a sign on their hospital room door that warned of contagious disease until such time the resistance could get the patient to Switzerland or Spain or back to their home country. The Germans were deathly afraid of contagious diseases because it would wipe out the whole platoon. And another way my father saved many a pilot's life was by writing a fictional story of his injuries. He had to set numerous bones, things got worse every week for the patient, had to be reset multiple times, gangrene set in, and 3 months later the patient had still not improved and had all kinds of infections. And I read some of those stories in his books that he kept from everything he did in the hospital. And then suddenly there was no more record of that patient. He simply disappeared from the records and out of the hospital. And even though the workload was enormous for my father and the other doctors and nurses at the hospital, no new doctors could be found. There was simply none because the universities had all been closed by then. And many of the doctors went into the countryside in spite of the bombing to look for food and medicine smuggled from Brussels. And the last winter of the war was one of the coldest times anyone could remember. Even the rivers, most of the rivers froze over. And then posters were put up to encourage people to gather acorns in the forest. Then they started to go in the abandoned houses, mostly in the big cities where all the Jewish people were taken. And some of those houses were very old, and the wood had really no more energy in it and only burned for a few hours. And they would take stair rails and wooden floors, and all for no more few hours of warmth. On the beaches they would look for wood. That didn't burn very well either. The moral and ethical standards started to break down in this time of extreme hardship. In the playgrounds, the adults would offer children something sweet in exchange for their shoes. And baby carriages left for a moment unattended, while the mother stood in line for a bowl of soup, are immediately stolen. Not the baby was put on the sidewalk. The food shortages became so acute that soup kitchens that had been able to serve meals with about 1,400 calories were now reduced to serving meals with about 400 calories. And this was particularly true for the big cities like Amsterdam and The Hague. Sugar beets, normally used for cattle feed, were now eaten by humans. And even tulip bulbs, which I found out were in the onion family, so they had some vitamins. And they were cooked and made into mush, and my mother would sometimes bake or fry them. They were very bitter and very hard to digest, and I know from personal experience, much worse than spinach. Recipes for dandelion and nettle soup were passed around. But the big cities started to starve to death. Emaciated dead bodies in the street became such a common sight that nobody paid any attention to them anymore. People just stepped over the bodies without so much as a glance. And we as kids, we just looked, is that a friend of ours? Oh, no, okay. Then we just passed by. We became totally desensitized. The Germans finally pressed people into service to collect the dead in hand carts and to bury them in mass graves. In Amsterdam alone, 18,000 people died of starvation during that very cold winter. But neutral Sweden and the US sent some flour and some medicine, but it was never enough. And finally, towards the last months of the wars, the Germans allowed some food drops by the Allied forces. And many people who heard the news and knew where the drops were going to take place, they went to get to it. The planes came over so low that you could see the pilots' faces. And huge parcels fell out. And in the first rush, and nothing was organized yet, many people were killed when those bundles fell on top of them. And that became known as typical Dutch humor as the Great Spam Massacre. On March 1, 1945, our city of Roermond was liberated by Canadian troops. And the only thing we saw of the German retreat was soldiers leaving town pushing loaded baby prams. And just in case they didn't know where to go, the Dutch quickly put up signs like this, "Nach Deutschland." And suddenly we were allowed in the streets again, and there was not an enemy to be seen. But warnings came quickly that many things that were not familiar might have been booby traps. Even the toys were booby trapped. And the soldiers we saw then had different uniforms on. But they also didn't know where to go, so the Dutch kids had to tell them. And they handed out chocolate and chewing gum, the first taste I'd ever had of such a thing. Unfortunately, only one piece of chewing gum came home with my father, and we had to share with all 10 or 11. My day was Tuesday. temporary pontoon bridges were built. And my father, of course, dug up his French wines from the garden and he traded them for cigarettes and other things. Our house was still standing, although it was full of shrapnel holes. And when I saw it a few years ago, those holes are still in it. This is in front of our house. They were very happy to...
Stop.
Oh, wait a minute, there we go. To pose for us. But when we took our first look at it, I saw a sight I'll never forget. There was a soldier, a black soldier, hanging out of the top window, and he was wearing my aunt's hat, complete with huge ostrich feathers. So my father called out, "Hey, you there, this is my house." And he had disappeared and he ran out the back door. We never saw him. On May 5, which is celebrated today in Holland, Germany surrendered. But that day, retreating German soldiers took up sniper positions in many other towns and shot at random in the celebrating crowds, killing many. There's a cathedral in the background which was totally destroyed, and it's now rebuilt. That's where I was baptized. Why doesn't it go? Oh yeah. My very first drawing of the celebrations, we're all standing there in front of the city hall, the master of ceremony, and we're singing our little hearts out in patriotic songs. Our first day home, a few extra kids, still some to come. But we were free at last. After the war, I was sent to a camp to fatten up, because I hadn't eaten enough, apparently, from the tulip bulbs. I didn't particularly like them. And this is the day we came home. My brother was sent for company. After this slide, I'm going to read you the letter of Bette Vries that she sent to my parents in November 1945, so a few months after the war. It says, "Dear Dr. and Mrs. Landman, at last I'm writing you. You probably think I forgot all about Roermond, that's the town we were in. But especially these last days, I'm reminded it's exactly 1 year ago that the terrible bombing took place, as you know. You went down with me, Scarla Hain, and Aunt Caroline to go shopping, as usual, while I, with Tilly and Nieke, are hiding in the basement. I tremble and turn pale just thinking about it. Because of all kinds of circumstances, I did not go to Amsterdam until the second half of July. I went first to Eindhoven, and my apartment in Amsterdam, fortunately, did not get ransacked by the Germans, and the landlord left everything intact to await my return. That was very kind of him, and I could move in right away. But he demanded 2 years of back pay, which was a financial blow to me. It was extremely difficult to find a reasonable apartment in Amsterdam due to the enormous shortages of housing. On top of that, I knew my sister and her daughter were coming back from Sweden, and they needed housing too. So now all three live here. Alas, her husband and son did not come back. My brother-in-law died 2 days before the liberation in the camp of Darno on May 6, and my nephew died on June 12 in Wüstengiersdorf. He must have known about the end of the war. Both places are very close together in Lower Silesia, south of Breslau, near the border of Czechoslovakia. It's an enormous blow for my sister, almost impossible to bear. But she tries to be strong, and you know from experience what it feels like to lose a child. I lost a brother at age 3. That's why she writes that way. You know from he was such my nephew was such a wonderful, promising 20-year-old boy. I told you about him, remember? Philip always thought that they were brought to Bergen-Belsen, but they never went there. From Holland they went straight to Auschwitz and never went via Westerbork and had horrible experiences. My niece and sister were in 9 different concentration camps. The men did not get moved around as much, but had it much worse. From the Sobel camp, almost all perished. A few returned, more women than men. The men were treated like beasts. You can imagine how it was. It's a wonder that some came out of there alive. Every day I hear new stories about my family, and when you hear that, it makes your blood boil, that the world is so tolerant with the Germans and the people who cooperated with them. Did you know that only 26 million Europeans were murdered in the concentration camps by the Germans? Whatever punishments these barbarians get, it will never be enough for what they have done. I cannot describe all the things they did, but the most terrible were the transports. At the last transport of which my sister and niece were part of, the SS and the criminal gypsies who were the guards hit people on the head with metal bars. My sister and niece were also beaten, and blood streamed down their faces. The wife of Bob Scholte, who stood next to my sister, got beaten so hard she died. But when they thought she was still alive, they strangled her for good measure. I could tell you more horror stories, but will not do it as it makes me sick. My eldest sister's husband is also gone, but we do not know what happened to him. My mother was taken on September 20, 1943, and she was brought to Westerbork, and on October 19, she was transported to Auschwitz, where she was gassed. I went back and forth to Amsterdam to get ready for the return of some of my family. Time flies. On August 18, they arrived in Amsterdam, and I'm working in an office since September 1. But there's not much to do, there's hardly any commerce. There is still a lot of rationing and lack of coal and other materials, but mostly lack of workers, here as well as in other countries. And I think it will be another year or longer before we'll be able to buy things without rationing cards. I had trouble getting used to living again in Amsterdam. I disliked everything. I miss so many of my family, friends and acquaintances in every neighborhood, and especially in the south of Amsterdam. People that I knew were not there anymore. Amsterdam is not the same as it was before the war. Everything looks very run down, but those are superficial things that can be restored. So it's only a question of time and money, and hopefully everything will be in order again. When are you coming to Amsterdam? I would love to see you. You're always welcome. Now there's enough food and we have an extra bed. Maybe you can get a ride with someone, because the train trips are not very good yet. When I had to go to Amsterdam, I had to stand up in a cattle car. I have to finish now, I have some work to do, and I would love to hear how you're all doing. Greetings, Bep de Vries.
I'm an amateur photographer, and I found the pictures very interesting and moving. But I can't help but wonder, where did all the film come from? Did you have to smuggle it in, or did the Germans allow it to be manufactured and sold?
There was still film available, but it was very bad quality, as you could see on some of the pictures. And others was pictures I got from the archives and from the hospital and from books. And they are a little bit better quality, probably made by war reporters. I'm going to read you the letter of Bep de Vries that she sent to my parents in November 1945, so a few months after the war. It says, "Dear Dr. and Mrs. Landman, at last I'm writing you. You probably think I forgot all about Roermond, that's the town we were in. But especially these last days, I'm reminded it's exactly 1 year ago that the terrible bombing took place, as you know. You went down with Mies Carla Heijn and Aunt Caroline to go shopping, as usual, while I, with Tilly and Nieke, were hiding in the basement. I tremble and turn pale just thinking about it. Because of all kinds of circumstances, I did not go to Amsterdam until the second half of July. I went first to Eindhoven, and my apartment in Amsterdam fortunately did not get ransacked by the Germans, and the landlord left everything intact to await my return. That was very kind of him, and I could move in right away. But he demanded 2 years of back pay, which was a financial blow to me. It was extremely difficult to find a reasonable apartment in Amsterdam due to the enormous shortages of housing. On top of that, I knew my sister and her daughter were coming back from Sweden, and they needed housing too. So now all three live here. Alas, her husband and son did not come back. My brother-in-law died 2 days before the liberation in the camp of Darno on May 6, and my nephew died on June 12 in Wüstengiersdorf. He must have known about the end of the war. Both places are very close together in Lower Silesia, south of Breslau, near the border of Czechoslovakia. It's an enormous blow for my sister, almost impossible to bear. But she tries to be strong, and you know from experience what it feels like to lose a child. I lost a brother at age 3. That's why she writes that way. You know from my nephew was such a wonderful, promising 20-year-old boy. I told you about him, remember? Philip always thought that they were brought to Bergen-Belsen, but they never went there. From Holland they went straight to Auschwitz and never went via Westerbork and had horrible experiences. My niece and sister were in 9 different concentration camps. The men did not get moved around as much, but had it much worse. From the Sobel camp, almost all perished. A few returned, more women than men. The men were treated like beasts. You can imagine how it was. It's a wonder that some came out of there alive. Every day I hear new stories about my family, and when you hear that, it makes your blood boil, that the world is so tolerant with the Germans and the people who cooperated with them. Did you know that only 26 million Europeans were murdered in the concentration camps by the Germans? Whatever punishments these barbarians get, it will never be enough for what they have done. I cannot describe all the things they did, but the most terrible were the transports. At the last transport of which my sister and niece were part of, the SS and the criminal gypsies who were the guards hit people on the head with metal bars. My sister and niece were also beaten, and blood streamed down their faces. The wife of Bob Scholte, who stood next to my sister, got beaten so hard she died. But when they thought she was still alive, they strangled her for good measure. I could tell you more horror stories, but will not do it as it makes me sick. My eldest sister's husband is also gone, but we do not know what happened to him. My mother was taken on September 20, 1943, and she was brought to Westerbork, and on October 19 she was transported to Auschwitz, where she was gassed. I went back and forth to Amsterdam to get ready for the return of some of my family. Time flies. On August 18 they arrived in Amsterdam, and I'm working in an office since September 1. But there's not much to do, there's hardly any commerce. There is still a lot of rationing and lack of coal and other materials, but mostly lack of workers, here as well as in other countries. And I think it will be another year or longer before we'll be able to buy things without rationing cards. I had trouble getting used to living again in Amsterdam. I disliked everything. I missed so many of my family, friends and acquaintances in every neighborhood, and especially in the south of Amsterdam. People that I knew were not there anymore. Amsterdam is not the same as it was before the war. Everything looks very run down, but those are superficial things that can be restored. So it's only a question of time and money, and hopefully everything will be in order again. When are you coming to Amsterdam? I would love to see you. You're always welcome. Now there's enough food and we have an extra bed. Maybe you can get a ride with someone, because the train trips are not very good yet. When I had to go to Amsterdam, I had to stand up in a cattle car. I have to finish now, I have some work to do, and I would love to hear how you're all doing. Greetings, Bert de Vries.
amateur photographer, and I found the pictures very interesting and moving. But I can't help but wonder, where did all the film come from? Did they have to smuggle it in, or did the Germans allow it to be manufactured and sold?
There was still film available, but it was very bad quality, as you could see on some of the pictures. And others was pictures I got from the archives and from the hospital and from books. And they are a little bit better quality, probably by made by war reporters.
I saw on Channel 2 or 11, maybe some other people, it's about the Ukraine, and this woman became a college professor, a president of the college, but at the end she said, after watching the film, she said, "You are a witness," and I think we're all a witness here tonight. I've become a witness just listening to you.
Thank you very
thank
much.
you very much.
Yes, you all are witnesses, and I hope this is going never to be forgotten. Yes.
I'll use the mic. Just for all the young people who are here tonight, what do you hope they take away from what you've shared with us? What did you say? For all the young people here tonight, the students, what do you hope that they've learned from you tonight?
Really what I would like to say is, don't ever forget, and you can stand up to such things. When you see evil, don't just walk away from it. Do something about it.
I did want to say,